Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Monday, September 16th. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Coming up, as more and more Americans choose cremation after death, thousands are choosing to send their ashes into space.
I mean, you dream it, somebody will make it happen for you, right?
More on so-called memorial space flights coming up in just a few minutes. But first, today's headlines. Health officials have confirmed a Fresno County resident has died of West Nile virus. Across California, of 38 people known to have contracted the mosquito-borne virus, 4 have died, including another person in Merced County earlier this month. Symptoms of the virus include fever, headaches, and body aches. Health officials urge people to wear mosquito repellent and remove standing water on their property. A memorial is being held later this morning for the longtime public information officer at Fresno City College. According to reports, Kathy Bonilla died last weekend and is survived by her husband and her daughter. Bonilla was 63 years old and served in her role at the college for 32 years. She's a Merced native, and her colleagues are remembering her as an extremely professional and warm person. A funeral is planned for later this month. A man who went missing in Yosemite National Park last month has been found dead. The Park Service reported over the weekend Kirk S. Thomas Olson was found following a backpacking trip from which he never returned. Olson was 61 years old. New research shows climate change not only poses risks to agriculture, it can also amplify the industry's environmental impacts. KVPR's Carrie Klein reports on the study in the peer-reviewed journal Science.
The study was published earlier this month by researchers in China, the U.S., and Europe. They found that as climate change threatens agricultural productivity and yield, it could also result in higher concentrations of crop pests. Both of these could require increased use of pesticides and other agrochemicals. A generally warming climate could also increase greenhouse gas emissions, water use, and soil erosion related to the industry. The authors suggest accelerating investment into climate-friendly agriculture and new technologies like precision farming and on-farm solar energy development. For KVPR News, I'm Carrie Klein.
The city of Porterville is suing the Tulare County Regional Transit Agency. City officials say they are owed $3 million, which the city argues it is spent to cover costs that actually fell on the transit agency. Porterville officials accuse the county's transit agency of financial mismanagement while saying they've had to foot the bill to maintain the agency's vehicles. The city also says it's owed money from a loan it gave the transit agency but hasn't been repaid. It's officially Hispanic Heritage Month. This weekend, thousands descended into downtown Fresno to kick off celebrations of Latin American culture. Music, dance, and colorful art was on display for the annual event, known as Fiestas Patrias. Mexicans are also celebrating their country's national independence today.
KVPR is in the midst of our fall membership campaign. We're public media, and that means we rely on listeners like you to fund everything we do, from podcasts like this one to news on our website and radio broadcasts on 89.3 in Fresno and 89.1 in Bakersfield. Support local journalism in your community with a donation now. Go to kvpr.org/donate to become a member today.
And now to our main story. Maybe you've been dying to go to space, but would you consider going to space after you've died? More and more people are choosing to launch cremated ashes into the cosmos. KVPR's Carrie Klein set out to learn why and how.
Wendy Yang always admired her older sister, Sai Vang.
She was a person who really loved living the autonomy of life.
They grew up in Visalia in the San Joaquin Valley. As an adult, Sai lived in San Francisco, and when she wasn't working, she traveled to more than 40 countries.
One of my most proudest accomplishments while traveling was climbing the Mount Everest.
But in 2020, when Sai was just 43, she was diagnosed with cervical cancer.
We found out in May, November she passed.
But before she did, Wendy says Sai told her she wanted to be cremated and put Wendy in charge of dispersing the ashes. Wendy considered dropping them out of a plane or scattering them at sea, but then...
I was like, well, What about space?
And that's how she came to be standing near Vandenberg Space Force Base on the Central Coast earlier this summer, as a rocket carrying her sister's ashes prepared to blast off.
All systems go.
A company called Celestis was in charge. It specializes in so-called memorial space flights. They packed less than a teaspoon of Psy's ashes into a tiny capsule the size of a watch battery. Then that and 62 capsules with other people's remains were tucked into a satellite and placed in a rocket.
T-minus 10, 9.
And that launched into the sky as Wendy and other family members watched.
3, 2, 1, ignition.
When the satellite reached orbit, Wendy finally felt relief. She found herself telling her sister,
You can go. You can go. You can go now.
this satellite will orbit the Earth for 3 to 5 years before it falls and burns up in the atmosphere. The company's least expensive spaceflight costs $3,500. That's less than half the median cost of a traditional funeral and viewing. Celestis president Colby Youngblood says that's the goal.
To make space accessible for everyone.
Even if that's after death. Which, ironically, is how the creator of the original Star Trek TV show, Gene Roddenberry, visited space.
The final frontier.
Celestis was the first to offer memorial space flights in 1997. Youngblood says they've sent up the remains of more than 2,000 people, and demand is increasing.
Skyrocketing, literally, to use the pun.
So is demand for cremation. Barbara Kebis of the Cremation Association of North America says that's partly because Americans are becoming less religious and they move more.
And so having a cemetery with generations of family members may be less critical, and cremation may be more appealing.
All that has sparked creativity in how people honor the remains. Kebis says encasing them in jewelry is popular.
I know of an artist who incorporates the cremated remains into paint and can paint a portrait.
Ashes can be packed into fireworks and even shotgun casings.
Often way to memorialize somebody is to go out on that first day of hunting season and include them in the hunt one last time. I mean, you dream it, somebody will make it happen for you, right?
Wendy Yang's dream was for her sister Psy to keep on traveling, but she didn't realize Psy's spaceflight would change her worldview too.
When it dawned on me that my sister is orbiting, it just kind of felt like there's someone up there that loves me,
She says she'll never look at the sky the same again. For KVPR News, I'm Carrie Klein.
That story was produced with the support of the California Newsroom. Carrie Klein now joins me at our KVPR studios to chat a little more about her story. Hi, Carrie.
Hi, Liz.
So is the sole purpose of this satellite that's been sent into orbit for these people's ashes? And does the rocket belong to Celestis?
No, and I find this part really fascinating. It's kind of a window into, how commercialized space is becoming. So the rocket that carried these remains was actually owned by SpaceX, and that's the company owned by Elon Musk. It was their rocket called Falcon 9, which launches a couple times a week, and companies can rent space on it to deliver their own stuff called payloads into orbit. This was actually called a rideshare mission, and a few times a year, Celestis rents out space on this rideshare, as do lots of other companies. Interestingly, the satellite that's currently orbiting, which was carried by SpaceX, that satellite doesn't belong to Celestis either. It's called a CubeSat satellite. Its main purpose is a kind of research out there in orbit, and the little box with human remains is just along for the ride and is tucked inside this satellite.
Okay, you said that this is just one kind of spaceflight offered by Celestis. So what are the others and what's the cost look like?
Yeah, well, so there are 4 different options offered by Celestis. This is kind of the middle of the range. The simplest option is a quick flight. It goes up a few miles into lower orbit and then back down. Families actually get those ashes back so they can say that their loved one has been to space and back. That one's $3,500. The mission that Sai Vang and those 62 others were on into orbit, that's $5,000 to get onto that flight. And then for $12,000, the company can deposit your remains on the moon. They have had one successful mission to the south pole of the moon, or they can also launch into deep space. You'll go 200 million miles and orbit the sun basically forever. And there are a small number of other companies out there offering similar flights at similar prices.
That is just crazy. And it's pretty wild that Gene Roddenberry used this service. I understand he's not the only celebrity whose remains have gone to space.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? So Celesta's president, Colby Youngblood, told me that a number of Star Trek actors, too, have used this service. Also, sci-fi writer Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey, and there have been famous athletes, and the company has even sent hair samples from a bunch of former presidents, including JFK, George Washington, and Dwight D. Eisenhower, and all of those were donated by a private collector who somehow got these remains. Interestingly, back to Gene Roddenberry, the first Celestis flight in 1997 was not actually his first time in space. His ashes were also smuggled onto a NASA space shuttle in 1992 by an astronaut, and then they were returned to his family on Earth.
So as space becomes more commercial, there are concerns that are kind of growing for space junk or overcrowding in the orbit. So what are companies like these doing to prevent that issue?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, the fact that these companies rent space with each other is something they tout as minimizing junk, as in, there's not a tiny little box in orbit for every one of these missions. They're tucked inside spacecraft that are already being used for other missions. But also, the Federal Aviation Administration has proposed some rules to limit the lifespans of satellites in orbit so that they don't stay out there forever. And from what I understand, those rules are not set in stone yet, but Celestis said they're going with companies that are preemptively following those rules. And that's why this latest mission will come back down in just a few years.
Okay, that was KVPR reporter Carrie Klein. Thanks for joining us, Carrie.
Yeah, thank you, Liz.
And that does it for today. Thank you for listening. If you have feedback on today's episode or a story idea, you can email us at podcast@kvpr.org. It's only our second week of production here at Central Valley Daily. If you like what you've been hearing, help us build some momentum by leaving a 5-star rating in your podcast app. Even better, share the podcast with a friend. We really appreciate it. Today's episode was produced by Jonathan Linden and KVPR with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.